everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today with two new ranges on the horizon for these guys. Well, a sort of new and a returning range. We're going to be looking at one of the armies that causes massive controversies amongst historians and wargamers alike of the Napoleonic period, the army of the Spanish. Now, I've got my own views on these guys, and they're no doubt clouded by my own biases, so I'm going to try and leave them out of it and concentrate on the facts. Please feel free to discuss your own thoughts in the comments below. Now, this is going to be the penultimate video series on the armies of the major powers, with only Prussia left to go. So, while you're down in the comments, then please leave me a note of who you'd like to see next. I'm going to go and move on to the minor powers, your Bavarias, your Polands, your Portugals, countries like that. So, any ideas, please leave them in the comments below, and we'll see what we get on with. Now, in this video we're going to look at the infantry. Cavalry and artillery will be in part 2. So with those caveats out of the way, let's get started. Now, to understand the condition of the army in the 1800s, we must first put it into its wider historical context. Spain at this time was a European backwater. For nearly 500 years it had been occupied by the Muslim armies and was only unified in the opening years of the 16th century. But then, like the birth of a new star, Spain exploded onto the scene in great violence, becoming arguably the world's first global empire. By the mid-16th century, Spain was fabulously rich, with Aztec gold flooding in on the treasure fleets from Mexico, the plantations of the Caribbean, including the strategic keystone of Cuba and its trading posters in the Far East, the Philippines in particular. Her tercio were the best army in the world. Her huge multi-decked warships ruled the seas. But it always had the feeling of a peasant that had found a bag of money, rich beyond measure, not really knowing how to spend it. And she lacked the refinements of the courts of Europe, particularly if we consider Italy and France in the 16th century, and then later Austria. The Enlightenment only really reached Madrid in the 1750s. Held back by dogmatic religious views that saw the expulsion of all remaining Muslims and the Jews from the country, wild spending by the ruling classes, and a lack of new foreign opportunities, soon all the money from this burgeoning Spanish Empire had run out. Pirate activity in the Americas, the catastrophic failure of the invasion of England, and the defeat in several wars saw Spain drop behind as other nations, particularly England, grew to dominate. After defeat in the War of the Spanish Succession, the ruling family of Spain became the same as those kings that sat in the Louvre, the Bourbons. This, of course, led to a close alliance between the Catholic neighbours, ruled by cousins, and now we finally get to where we are in the Napoleonic era. Because of the alliance with France, Spain's land borders were secure, only tiny Portugal sharing another border with them. She still had colonies in the New World, and this was costing the treasury a lot of money. While the golden age of piracy was long gone, the British had occupied a string of islands that dominated the entrance to the Caribbean, the Windward Islands. Now, this meant that realistically the British had a say on who came and went from South America, unless the ships did a huge loop around the coast of America, up past Cuba and Florida, adding perhaps weeks onto the journey. Their Far Eastern concerns were similarly under threat from Chinese pirates, Barbary corsairs operating off Somalia and Madagascar as well. For these reasons, as Spain returned to poverty, more and more funds went on the navy, the army being left to rot. The French Revolution suddenly deposed the Bourbons. That alliance and secure land border started to look slightly less secure, especially after they cut Louis XVI's head off. With the whole of Europe in upheaval and countries taking sides as the first coalition drew up, Spain did, I think, perhaps the worst thing that any country can do during a moment of global crisis. She vacillated. At once, she sided with the first coalition and then settled into an uneasy agreement with Republican France. This was strengthened when the British attacked the River Plate in an attempt to seize Uruguay and Argentina. The campaign, one that was a bit of a disaster for the British. I talk about it a little bit in the Napoleonic figures on Bob Crawford, but yeah, I might do a full series on that in the future because it's a very little known part of the early Napoleonic Wars. It's quite an interesting one. However, later than that, at the high point of Napoleonic coordination between France and Spain came famously in 1805, when they worked in complete tandem to orchestrate synchronised sinking off of Cape Trafalgar. No, but seriously though, the Spanish Navy, despite having huge amounts of money spent on it, was incredibly outdated. both in ships and in tactics. The flagship, the Santa Misa Trinidad, a massive 4-deck behemoth, was too large and cumbersome to catch the sleeker, more modern British ships, and so suffered an ignominious fate. The smaller ships of the Spanish didn't have the level of training that the British officers and crew had. There's also technological differences as well. I don't want to get into it too much here, but there are things like the British had flintlock cannons, and the Spanish were still using the old matchlock ones. You know, the old, you stick your taper in there and it burns, it fizzes down and then explodes like you see in the films. Which obviously means that they're a lot less predictable, they can't fire as quickly, things like that. So I don't really want to go into that here because it's not a Spanish Navy video. But yeah, the Spanish had loads of money spent on their Navy, but unfortunately they were preparing for the last war. They were still fighting the 7 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, not the modern ships that the British had. Spain as a power was finished. With the destruction of its navy, it had no real way of fighting the English, and the British then placed a blockade on Spain. Stopped any goods coming into Spanish ports, including the revenue from their overseas territories, and so they had to capitulate. This, of course, went against Napoleon's enforced continental system, and the French Emperor also saw that it could provide a backdoor into France, so he had to go and sort it out himself. In 1807, the Spanish monarchy, shall we say, invited the French army to enter the country in order to take Portugal. Most notable commander of this army was Junot, who crossed the Pyrenees on the 12th of October, 1807, and alongside Spanish forces entered Portugal on the 19th of November. Unsurprisingly, most of the Spanish civilians considered this to be an invasion, and tension, whilst a lid was kept on it, simmered under the surface. Eventually, tiring of Ferdinand VII and his mealy-mouthed ways, which, unfortunately for him, he was kind of forced into, Napoleon deposed him, placing his eldest brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. This was too much for the Spanish to bear, and on the 3rd of May 1808, mass rioting broke out across Spain, particularly in Madrid. J.M. Thompson wrote that the Spanish revolt was, quote, a reaction against new institutions and ideas, a movement for loyalty to the old order, to the hereditary crown of the most Catholic kings, which Napoleon, an excommunicated enemy of the Pope, had put on the head of a Frenchman, to the Catholic Church, persecuted by Republicans who had desecrated their churches, murdered priests, and enforced a loi de culte, and to locals and provincial rights and privileges threatened by an efficiently centralised government, end quote. After a particularly brutal policing action performed unfortunately by the Muslim cavalry of Napoleon's guard, the church, as important to the 19th century Spaniards as it was to the 15th century ones, declared Napoleon an antichrist, sending the insurrecto into supernova. Now, the insurrecto was the rebellion, the rising up against the French now authorities. If you'd like to know more about this incident, we looked at it in depth on my video on the light cavalry of the Guard, and I also talked about it in the Napoleonic figures, a video of Augustina of Zaragoza. Mission of the Church, the Spanish army now joined the revolt. The army of Spain was a huge one. There were 110 battalions of infantry and 26 regiments of cavalry. Artillery was in relatively short supply, with less than 20 batteries, but on paper, the Spanish army was a formidable one. Or should I say Spanish armies? Units were divided into 7 armies, including a reserve, each with areas of Spain that were their jurisdiction. The army of the centre was commanded by General Castanos, and was the largest, with 69 battalions of infantry and 60 squadrons of cavalry, totalling around 45,000 men. The army of Galicia under General Blake was the next largest, with 37,000 men in 79 battalions of infantry and 4 squadrons of cavalry. The commander of the next largest was General Palafox's Army of Aragon, who, in 32 battalions of infantry and 5 cavalry squadrons, commanded 23,449 men and 1 woman. Now, again, we've done a video on her, which can be found linked at the end of the video. The other 3 armies were all about 12,000 men in 4 or 5 regiments, and a regiment of cavalry, known as the Army of Estremadura, Granada, and Samosierra. Now, the infantry was made up of several different classifications, and this is what we're going to focus on in this video. We're only 10 minutes in, and we finally got to the thing that we're focusing on. There were 35 line regiments, 12 light infantry, 10 foreign line regiments, including 6 Swiss, which for some reason were counted separately on the rolls. Weird. Now there were 35 infantry regiments, and each regiment had 3 field battalions. These battalions were formed up of 4 companies each, and while the 1st and 2nd battalion would often fight in close proximity, the 3rd was either often in a separate brigade, or it could even be an entirely separate army as well. The 3rd battalion seemed to have been sort of a bit of an extra, a reserve almost. These regiments were named either after honorifics or the location in which they were raised. So the 1st and 2nd regiment being the Rey or Renya, obviously the King and Queen's regiment, the 7th being Zamora, and the 17th being Mallorca, and obviously their locations in Spain. A line battalion would have a paper strength of 700, although I think probably 400 or 500 men would be considered the norm, with some notable exceptions, it has to be said. In these exceptions, we need to go on a slight tangent, and in 1807, in March, Napoleon dispatched an expeditionary force to Denmark under the command of the Marquess de la Romana. Regiments would be given men from other battalions to bring them up to full strength. So the armies that were part of La Romana's brigades, they were at full strength. The rest of them were those weaker, about 500 men in a battalion. Now the first 2 companies of the 1st battalion of every regiment were grenadiers, with the other 10 companies being fusiliers. They were often, but not always, detached to form separate units in the manner of the Russians and Austrians, although again these grenadier companies could be completely detached, even so much as being sent into a different army. Troops were line troops in the Austrian tradition. They would not skirmish. Any skirmishing and light infantry duties would be performed by the dedicated light infantry regiments, but we'll get on to them in a bit. We'll talk about the line first. Uniforms for the Spanish line were white, both jackets and gaiters, and a large bicorn in the early period, changing to a shako after 1812, when the British started providing their uniforms. I should say selling uniforms to them. They made quite a lot of money out of that. The Grenadiers, on the other hand, wore really cool, unique bearskins. I can't really describe them very well. They're sort of a bit like a Russian mitre. Sort of. Instead of like the brass plate at the front, though, they're fur. They're like a cloth. And as it dips down at the back, instead of sort of going to a crown, they've got like a sock that hangs down. It's called a flame. And it was actually a bag for the bearskin. These were incredibly well detailed, very exquisite. Hopefully I'll find some nice pictures to put into the slideshow, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. They certainly stood out, and they're a really cool, unique part of Spanish armies. Regiments would be distinguished from each other due to different facings, and very, very early in our period, battalions would carry 2 flags, but by 1802 they were ordered to carry only 1 per battalion, the second often being left in a church in the unit's depot. Training wildly varied across regiments, from non-existent to abysmal. Napier, who, to be fair, has been accused of being anti-Spanish, wrote, quote, "I come now to another topic, which is one of serious consideration. That is the frequent, I ought to say constant and shameful misbehaviour of the Spanish troops before the enemy. In the Battle of Talavera, in which the Spanish army, with very trifling exceptions, was not engaged, whole corps threw away their arms and ran off in my presence, when they were neither attacked nor threatened with an attack, but frightened, I believe, by their own fire. I mean the infantry. It is lamentable to see how bad that some of the Spaniard is. It is said that sometimes they behave well, though I acknowledge I have never seen them behave otherwise than ill. Nothing can be worse than the officers of the Spanish army." Continues, "I cannot say they do anything as ought to be done, with the exception of running away and assembling again in a state of nature. The Spaniards have neither the numbers, efficiency, discipline, bravery, or arrangements to carry on the contest." End quote. So I think it's safe to say Napier, not a massive fan of the Spanish army. Now that said, individual units, as he sort of acknowledged, did act with considerable skill and bravery. In a letter to Lord Castlereagh, Captain W. Parker Carroll of the Connaught Rangers describes an action on the 28th of October 1808, and he says this, quote, "The 1st Regiment of Catalonia received the attack with the greatest coolness and kept up a very regular fire by platoons, maintaining their position against an enemy nearly 5 times their number. The most veteran troops could not possibly have displayed more soldier-like firmness or more sang-froid in action." End quote. Now, I think, as with the Austrians and the Russians, the men of the Spanish army were hamstrung by an absolutely abysmal officer corps. But I'll be honest, the Spanish generals make the Austrian and Russian ones look like, I don't know, like Alexander the Great's generals or something, because these guys were shockingly bad. I mean, anyway, rank was gained almost entirely by position in courts, which, the liberal application of money would certainly help. Due to the national and military spending being heavily focused on the Navy, army commanders were pretty much left to their own devices. Inter-unit exercises were never conducted. Indeed, intra-unit exercises weren't conducted very often. Funds for target practice did not exist, meaning colonels would have to fund them out of their own pockets, and so invariably didn't. These regiments were almost private fiefdoms of the colonel in charge, and the men spent the vast majority of their time in their own side businesses. We saw in the Josephina of Aragon video that rather than soldiering, a lot of them, her husband did a lot of trading. They basically lived a life of skilled manual workers at the time, or, petty bourgeoisie. And they didn't have the draconian discipline that the Austrians and particularly the Prussians had. They were very easy pickings for this finely honed instrument that was the French army. Now, an exception to this would be the previously mentioned expeditionary force under Romana. These troops had trained alongside French regulars, with French advisors helping out, and they had also been well equipped by the French. Ironically, as it turned out, losing the campaign in Denmark, the Spanish were transported back in Royal Navy ships, and that's because obviously the British were aware that this insurrecto was going on, the army was rising up against the Spanish, and here was a very well-trained, well-equipped corps that would form the basis of the rebel army of Galicia. As this lack of ability, the separation of the armies under generals of different rank was an absolute disaster, because it meant that they would either blame their superiors for not giving them orders to do something, or they would blame their inferiors for not doing the orders that they gave them. So the French army suffered from this in the peninsula. But if you can, I'm going to go off topic a bit here. Hopefully this is going to explain it a bit easier for people who understand what I'm talking about. For the rest of you, just skip ahead a couple of minutes because it won't mean anything to you. But it's like the difference between man marking and zonal marking in football. So if there's a corner or a free kick coming in, now if it's your job to man mark, say, I don't know, Aguero. If your job is to mark Aguero and he scores, then it's your fault. You were the guy who was man marking Aguero. He got past you, he got away from you, and he scored. You're to blame. If it's zonal, well, there's not really anyone to blame, because who's at fault there? If he runs through, say, the defensive zones of 3 different defenders, well, should the guy have picked him up when he started his run? Should the second guy have picked him up when he realised that he was on the run? Or should the third guy have picked him up when he realised that he was going to be striking the ball in his zone? So, it's for me, as in football, I don't like zonal marking. I think having all these different armies under different commanders does not work. And I think the problem is, because no one's to blame, it means that no one has to take any responsibility. And to take it back to the Napoleonic period, and if you've just skipped over the football analogy, welcome back. If the French army, for argument's sake, leaves the sector of one army and enters another army, then which army should fight them? Should the first army follow that French army out of its sector, or should it stay defending the sector that it's been given? Now, if it moves out and helps out the second army, and it's a disaster, well, you've got an obvious fall guy there, haven't you? Why were they even here anyway? They should have been defending their sector, the other commander can say. If they win, then you can say, well, I won in spite of that other sector commander just sitting around with his thumb up his bum. So it's a really good idea on paper, especially somewhere like Spain, to separate it into various areas of operations. Great idea on paper. But in practice, it's fatally flawed. And it would only be resolved in 1812 with the announcement of a generalissimo, an overall general, a general's general, as it were. And such was the animosity amongst the Spanish that it had to fall to an outsider, General Wellesley, to be chosen to be Generalissimo. The Duke of Wellington ended up being the general of Spanish generals, and I think that's really when they started being able to contribute in a meaningful way. Even when this was decided, one of the commanders, General Ballesteros, had to be arrested and relieved of his command. I mean, they really, their own, like I say, their own fiefdoms were their own. They didn't give them up easy. I alluded to earlier, ironically, the same thing would affect the French armies in the peninsula as well. Particularly with General Soult, who, despite only being a general, refused to take orders from Massena, who was, of course, a marshal. The Spanish light infantry consisted of 12 massive regiments with a paper strength of 1,200 men in a single battalion. In 1808, these units were actually mostly up to strength, with the odd one actually being over strength, and that's something that we hardly ever see in the Napoleonic period. So big were these units, in fact, that on the battlefield they would normally be broken down into 2 units of 3 companies each, so each one about 600 men. Early in our period, they wore a green hussar-style jacket with tarlatan helmets, and they looked pretty snazzy, I have to say, but by 1808 they'd been issued a simpler uniform of a dark blue coat with different coloured facings. Gone were the tarlatans, replaced with the same bicorn as the line. In fact, to be honest, there's not actually that much difference between the 1808 Spanish light infantry and their line infantry counterpart, which is quite nice for wargamers because it means that you can use the same figures for both, really. The light infantry that served with Romana in his Danish expedition were also equipped by the French with the blue-tailed coat, and for them they had a black shako with a brass lozenge plate as well. So that's a way that you can distinguish them on the battlefield. You could use the mid-war Perrys or perhaps some Victrix. Warlord, maybe? Yeah, possibly the Warlord as well. They're just the same as French infantry, really. And they would look different in the brightly coloured Spanish army, that's for certain. These men would perform all of the skirmishing duties of the Spanish infantry, and to be honest, they actually weren't terrible at it. I mean, they weren't as good as the French or the British, but they certainly weren't as bad as the Russians. So, that's not bad. They were sort of standard infantry. One problem that was noted was that their long tailcoats got caught on sort of scrub and things like that you get in Spain, and that would impede them. That was a lesson that the British learned in the forests of North America about 30, 40 years beforehand. But the Spanish, with those long tailcoats given to them by the French, they would find that out themselves, and they'd often cut the tails off the coat. Now, I'm aware that this video is running a bit long, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this video with the foreign units, and we'll leave the Guard, the Provincial Militia, and the Guerrillas, together with an analysis of the Spanish Army's performance, in a part 2. So, there were 2 classifications of foreign infantry. The Swiss, that formed their own entry on the rolls, and the others, effectively, which were numbered as regiments of the line. These regiments were the 36th Islander, the 37th Hibernia, and the 38th Ultonia, which were all Irish regiments, the descendants of the famous Wild Geese. While these units began the rebellion as majority Irish, heavy losses and desertion meant that by the end of the war they were Irish in name only. The final regiment of the line of the foreign infantry, the Napoles, was, as the name suggests, made up of Neapolitans, or just Italians in general. These regiments on paper had the usual 3 battalions, but they were all chronically under strength in 1808, the Italians only being able to field 1 battalion. These foreign units wore uniforms the same as the Spanish, but instead of white, they wore coloured jackets, either bright blue or dark green. The Swiss, on the other hand, had a very different organisation, consisting of 6 regiments. Each had 2 battalions, with a paper strength of 1,200 men in 6 companies. Again, in the reality of our time frame, these units wouldn't be up to strength, but I would certainly class them as large units for black powder. They wore the same uniforms as the Spanish line, but instead of white coats they wore blue. Now, I have read that the entire 1st Battalion were Grenadiers, but I've only read that in one source. I'm not 100% sure about that one. I mean, you know, it sounds like a lot, but that said, these were mercenaries, so if you could afford to get a battalion of grenadiers, then I'm sure the Swiss could provide them. As the old saying went, no money, no Swiss. But as long as you had the money, I think they were absolutely fine. So that's it for this video. I'm going to cut it there, slightly less than half an hour. Join me again soon for the second part, where we'll discuss the Spanish Guard, including one of my favourite units of the war. Favourite in the sort of other meaning of the word. I just love them because they're super lame. The irregulars, the guerrilla bands, and also we'll have a discussion of the performance of the army in the field. So, as always, I hope you guys are staying safe. If you aren't subscribed to the channel, please, think about giving the channel a subscription. It really helps us out, and it means that you can see upcoming videos more easily. I also advertise on my Facebook page. That's the best way of finding out when I'm running live streams. The last one we did was on how to convert Russian hussars out of plastic. So that's quite interesting if you're interested in seeing the versatility of the plastic kits. But I'm going to leave that there. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Goodbye.